signs of things to come. Today, we're going to celebrate that first sign, water into wine. But on the agenda today is apothic red, familial tales, stone jars, and sacred celebrations. But let's start by diving straight in. And we're going to read this story from John 2. And I'm going to start at verse 1. I'm going to read all the way through to verse 11, where it says this. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied, "My hour has not yet come." But his mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," so they filled them to the brim. And then he told them, "Now draw out some water and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master tasted the water that had been turned into wine, and he did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. So he called to the bridegroom and asked, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best until now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first sign through which he revealed his glory, and the disciples believed in him. All right, great story, right? I mean, who doesn't love a Jesus that, 1, keeps the party going, and 2, does that using the good stuff? I mean, no apothic red nonsense here going on. And by the way, if you really like apothic red, that's fine. I am just snooty, so that's on me. Although I bet that Jesus agrees with me, and I can proof text that here in John 2. I bet he likes exactly the same wine that I do. However, this is still a pretty interesting story, particularly when John tells us that he thinks this right here, all of this wine, is the first sign of what is to come. So let's dig into this a bit and see what we can find today. Now, intriguingly, our story starts almost like it's in the middle of a thought, doesn't it? On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. We have no context for this. On the third day of what? We have no idea. If you go back to John 1, we get a story about John the Baptist. And then it says in verse 29 that the next day, John saw Jesus coming toward him. And then in verse 35, it says, the next day, John was there again with 2 of his disciples. And then in verse 43, it says, on the next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. And then at the start of chapter 2, it says, on the third day, there was a wedding. So it's possible we're just missing a few days here in the narrative because these days just don't really add up. I don't know what day we're on now, 6 or 7, who knows? Some scholars think that the 3 days are symbolic. And that because this is the first sign that points to resurrection, the 3 days, well, maybe they point us to the 3 days in the tomb. Maybe that seems a bit of a stretch, and it's certainly pretty speculative, though. There is, however, an interaction at the end of John 1 that might shed some light on this. A man named Nathanael comes to Jesus and declares his trust in Jesus, and Jesus says, that's great, but hold on to your hat, for you will see even greater things than this. Now, we know from John 21, at the end of the gospel, that Nathanael was indeed from Cana in Galilee. And so maybe he was at this wedding, and maybe that's where the reference comes from, that the wedding took place 3 days after Jesus promised to Nathanael. Of course, we don't know for sure. That's both the beauty and sometimes the frustration of biblical interpretation. Sometimes there is just so much room for speculation when we read. But I do like this as a possibility, because what it says to me is that even something as important as a sign of the resurrection started as a personal encounter. It came about in response to a conversation. It was the result of an expression of trust in Jesus. In fact, maybe the only reason we have this story, maybe the only reason we know it is because Nathan recognized this for what it was. A sign that his faith was not misplaced, and maybe he told this story far and wide, and maybe that story made its way all the way to John. And over time, that story, as it was passed and it was shared among the community, it became a sign for all of us, but first it was a sign for one person, Nathanael. And I think this kind of thing happens a lot more than we realize. Like, I know there are moments in my life when small things remind me of why I choose to trust in God. There are days when the truth is I don't believe. It's Lent. It's okay to say that, even if you're a pastor. But it's those days when I don't believe that I choose instead to trust. And those small moments, those signs that remind me that my trust is not misplaced, it's when I share those moments with others delicately and appropriately. But it's when I invite you into my story that my signs become your signs and vice versa. And maybe that's a bit of what's happening here, which I just really love. Nathaniel's story became John's story, becomes our story, because that's how faith and community work. Even still, though, we don't have much context here. We don't know who the lucky couple are. We don't know why Jesus and his mom and his disciples were invited to the party. But we do know, however, that the party runs out of wine. And maybe this was just bad planning. Maybe more guests showed up than expected. Maybe Jesus had more disciples than they thought. Maybe the crowd was just more ready to celebrate than anyone had anticipated. Either way, the wine runs out and Mary finds out. And so she asks Jesus to intervene. And he gives this sort of curt reply, "Woman, why do you involve me?" And that might sound harsh to our ears. If I was to refer to my mom or my partner as woman, that would not go over well, I can tell you that. This is not, however, how this term gunai implies tone here in Greek. Now, this was a common term of endearment or actually respect in Greek. And actually, I like the way that the First Nations version has translated this section. It says, "So the mother of Creator sets free." That's the name for Jesus that this translation uses. "The mother of Creator sets free, said to him, 'Son, they have no more wine.' 'Honored woman,' he said to her, 'why are you telling me this? Is this our concern? It is not yet my time to show who I am.' But his mother turned to the helpers and said, 'Do whatever he needs.'" And I really like that. First, because it actually does a better job of interpreting the scene. "Honored woman" is not as technically correct, but it is closer to the spirit of what's actually happening here in the Greek, how the term gunai would have been used. Second, though, I love the way that this captures the mother-son dynamic in the scene. Jesus asks Mary to intervene. He says, "Mom, don't get me involved in this. This isn't our issue." But Mary turns to the helpers instead and says, "Let's get this done." I kind of picture Mary here, keeping eye contact with Jesus the whole time as she beckons to the helpers and says, "Help him out." Either way, this sign reads kind of stiff to me in English, but in Greek, it just feels a lot more playful than that. Maybe more familial, if that makes sense. And I think that might actually be important. There are times when it's really easy to start thinking of Jesus as a genie. Right? We ask for things, he grants them. And there are ways of praying that presume upon Jesus in a very transactional, unrelational kind of way. Now, this moment feels perhaps like a bit of a counterpoint to all of that. Sometimes we ask, and sometimes Jesus says no, and sometimes we ask again, and sometimes Jesus relents. And I know that is not a very satisfying theology of prayer, but maybe that's the point. The prayer is less a transaction where we say the right words and we get the right outcomes, and more like a family encounter with sideways glances and inside jokes. And I think what I take from this is a reminder to treat my prayer more like a conversation with my mom and less like a contract to employ. Regardless, now we get to the heart of this scene. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used for ceremonial washing, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. So Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them to the brim. Now, 20 or 30 gallons times 6 stone jars means we are talking about up to about 180 gallons, or for us Canadians, 680 liters, or perhaps a more useful comparative here. That's about 900 bottles of wine. And I have no idea how many guests were at this party, but this is, shall we say, a lot to drink. Especially considering that this was already round 2, that the guests had already finished off everything the host had expected them to drink. And in fact, John goes out of his way to mention that the helpers were asked to fill the jars to their brims, or literally as far as their upward edge. So, this is wine overflowing. It probably sloshed about and splashed on the ground, even as they tried to draw a sip for the host to taste. But not only that, it was good wine, the best wine to boot. And John says this massive, overflowing quantity of really good wine meant to keep a party going long into the night, that this was the first sign of things to come. Except, I'm not actually sure the wine is the point. Now, before the sommeliers storm the stage, let me explain. There's this really interesting motif in John. Water, where it comes from, is a really big deal. In the next chapter, Jesus will talk about needing to be baptized in both water and spirit to enter the kingdom. In chapter 4, Jesus will meet a Samaritan woman at a well and talk to her about the gift of living water. In chapter 5, Jesus will heal a man at the pool of Bethesda, a man who hopes that the waters can heal him. And in chapter 6, Jesus will walk on water. You get the idea. You would expect that in a story about this much water and this much wine, that the source of that water would have some kind of attention. But instead, it's actually the vessels, these 6 stone jars, that seem to really capture John's focus. So what's going on there? Jars used for ceremonial washing. Is this for doing the dishes? Well, actually sort of, but also not really. These were used for cleansing dishes. But they were largely used for cleansing your hands and maybe even sometimes for cleansing your feet. And this idea of cleansing, this is a category that can be tough for us to get our heads around sometimes. We've probably all heard about the idea of something being clean and unclean in Judaism or perhaps in Islam. This does not necessarily mean dirty or bad. In English, we often associate a value judgment with language like clean and unclean. That's not necessarily what's going on in Judaism. My son has a really good friend who is Muslim, and they were comparing diets one day at school. My son is a vegetarian, and he found out that his friend also does not eat pig, and he was very excited about this. But he came home one day and he said to me, "Dad, you know how we're vegetarian? Well, it's a good thing we don't eat pigs because my friend told me that they are dirty." Now, I knew who he was talking about, so I clarified exactly what did your friend say here. And then we had a conversation about unclean in the religious sense and dirty in the hygienic sense, and how pigs are actually quite clean animals. We just don't eat them in our house the same way his friend doesn't for religious reasons. And by the way, enjoy your bacon. Just keep your memes to yourself. I've already seen them all. I know what I'm missing. It's fine. I'm kidding. Just send me whatever you want. In Judaism, though, a lot of things could make you ritually or ceremonially unclean. If you touched a grave, for example, or if you had touched blood, if you were a woman who was menstruating, if you had even walked across certain lands, these things could render you ceremonially unclean. That did not mean dirty or bad, though. And there were rituals like a mikvah that would rectify that and cleanse you, but unclean wasn't bad. It wasn't like unclean separated you from God's love and cleansing brought you back into God's good graces. In fact, in Judaism, it was expected that you would become unclean regularly just by going about your daily business. And that you would then cleanse yourself regularly to remind yourself of your connection and your commitment to God. That's what the rituals were meant for. Not good and bad, but rhythms of commitment. It's actually quite beautiful. And misunderstandings of these practices have been caricatured in far too many Christian sermons, and that's to our shame because we haven't learned and listened to our Jewish neighbors. But along with more elaborate ceremonies like a mikvah or a baptism, Jewish people would also often ceremonially wash their hands after something like coming home from the market or before enjoying a meal. Now, that does seem to be a bit of practical hygiene and religious observation combined together. But that's what these 6 stone jars would have been primarily used for at the entrance to a party. a ceremonial, religious, ritual cleansing that also had a very practical hygiene element to it. And in fact, John points out that they were made of stone precisely because stone, as a non-porous material, was protected from becoming ceremonially unclean. It was part of the Jewish teaching. That's why you would use these types of jars specifically to wash your hands or to wash your dishes. Now, as with any ritual, it was always possible for the meaning to be swallowed up by the practice, right? Jesus is quite critical of his fellow Pharisees that went through the motions and lost sight of the purpose. In Matthew 23, he says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you act like hypocrites. You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are still full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind teacher, first clean the inside, then the outside will be clean as well." Basically, he's saying the ritual is meant to help us remind us to keep our hearts pure. But if we don't do that, what's the point of the ritual? This right here is just good old Pharisaical teaching that any teacher of the law would have agreed with. Jesus is just calling out his contemporaries for not following through on the intent of the law. All this to say, when Jesus arrived at this party, he would have, in all likelihood, drawn water from these same 6 stone jars, washed his hands, and then entered the celebration just like any other Jewish guest. Except that when Jesus is asked with some help with the wine, he chooses these same 6 stone jars, and that's not just a coincidence. Remember, the whole reason that Mary has approached Jesus is because all the wine has run out in the first place. That means there are literally empty wineskins lying all over the place just waiting for their miracle. I mean, if he had wanted to, he could have kept the party going in a far less conspicuous manner. Instead, he chooses intentionally these jars, this symbol, as the sign through which he would make himself known. And think about that. Jesus takes a symbol of our personal piety, how those who knew God reminded themselves of God's quiet presence with them daily, how they set themselves apart in connection to the vine, trusting that it would help them become better persons in their lives, and Jesus transforms that ritual into a ruckus party that shook the neighborhood late into the night. And for John, I think, the symbolism of that moment, the sign was quite stark. No longer are we reminding ourselves of God's presence with us, but now God is declaring divine goodness among us. God is celebrating divine generosity around us. God is taking it upon God's self to turn our piety into God's party. And at this moment, this was no longer just the celebration of a random wedding in Cana of Galilee. This was no longer just a promise to Nathanael that he would see greater things. This was now the reminder that every wedding and every party and every over-the-top moment of unadulterated, unconstrained joy, all of these are now signs of everything that is to come. Because Jesus is saying that families united and neighbors invited, outsiders welcome, with more than enough to go around for anyone who happens by. That itself is the story of God, and every time we enact that, we point toward what is to come. One of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite authors, one that I have read here before, comes from Robert Farrar Capon, who writes this: "What we are watching for is a party. But that party is not just down the street making up its mind when it's going to come to us. It is already hiding in our basement, banging on the steam pipes and laughing its way up the cellar stairs. The unknown day and hour of its final bursting into the kitchen and roistering through the whole house is not dreadful. It is all part of the divine lark of grace. Because God is not our stuffy relative come to see whether the wedding present china is chipped. God is the funny old neighbor with a salami under one arm and a bottle of wine under the other, and we do indeed need to watch for God's arrival, but only because it would be such a pity to miss out on this much fun. That's what the sign is about. This is Jesus reassuring all of us that our rituals are not a waste, that our attempts to be kind are not overlooked, that every time we commit ourselves to the good, trusting that God will bring that story to completion, that in itself is an image of the world made right in joyful celebration. And perhaps right now, at this moment in history, just as it was in Jesus' day, that hope feels very far off. But the point of the sign, especially as we begin our movement toward the cross, is not to deny all of that hurt or to ignore what is happening in the world or even in your life right now. The point of the sign is to remind us to hold tight to the ritual of celebration and joy. To trust that even in the moments where we struggle to believe, celebration is blessed and gladness is holy, and that when we make sacred our parties, we can find the strength to return from them, committed even more to the work of justice that the world so deeply needs. And so as we begin our movement together toward both the darkness of the cross and the light and joy of the resurrection, might we all remember somehow that every moment of joy that breaks in anywhere in our lives, this is a sign of things to come. And that when we learn how to dance and celebrate and drink late into the night, we can be strengthened for the work of healing the world around us. Let's pray. God, for all the ways that you show up in all of our lives, reminding us that you are present and near, comforting and guiding, but also knitting back your world together. We thank you for those signs. But also we thank you for this sign, the story that started at a party as a response to a conversation and became a story that was included in our Gospels, that has founded and grounded the church for 2,000 years now. To remind us that our movement towards your kingdom starts with joy. And that all of the work that we do in the world, both internal work to become the people you imagine us to be, and the work we do for peace and justice around us in our relationships, all of that work is grounded in celebration. Trusting that the world has a destination. And that destination is your love and embrace, your kingdom that transforms everything. Might we trust in the renewal of all things, believing that you are already at work and we are part of that story. As we begin this movement toward Easter, help us to prepare our hearts well for the depth of Good Friday and the celebration of resurrection. In the strong name of the risen Christ we pray. Amen.